Welcome to Blockchain Recorded, the podcast for the tech curious, where we talk about anything and everything related to the exponentially evolving crypto, blockchain, and Web 3.0 space. Our mission is simple: to share knowledge, facilitate discourse, and help evolve education in blockchain fundamentals, decentralization solutions, and relevant use cases for today's digital economy. We at Blockchain Recorded are not registered investment advisors and do not deal with financial or trading token elements, nor offer any licensed financial services. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, while the opinions of all parties involved are their own. I'm your host, Nic Z, and now let's talk blockchain. Before I introduce our guest today, I have a couple of brief updates for our community. We invite everyone to join us on Twitter Spaces, where we pre-stream each episode the day before distributing it on all major podcast platforms. For the platform list, visit our website, blockchainrecorded.com. We also have a new NFT program with Blockchain Recorded Community NFTs. These can be claimed from our homepage. So check us out, visit our website, and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube for updates and potential airdrops. So without further ado, today with us we have Nic Z, the co-founder of Evmos. Nic, welcome to Blockchain Recorded.
Hey there. Happy to be here.
Just to give our audience a quick introduction of who you are, and then you can take it from there. Nic is a co-founder and contributor of Evmos, as mentioned, an EVM stack designed for seamless cross-chain dApp development that leverages the inter-blockchain communications, so the IBC protocol. He has previously done engineering work in Silicon Valley and works on open source blockchain projects. So, Nic, what brought you to Web3? And actually, later on, I'll ask you about co-founding Evmos, obviously, but give us a little more about who you are.
Totally. So, fairly early on, this was back in 2016, 2017, I was an undergrad at Cal, at UC Berkeley, and I happened to join a group called Blockchain at Berkeley that has become a little infamous at this point. And that was kind of an inflection. I joined at an inflection point for the group because there were a lot of things kicking off in 2017 as well in the Web3/crypto space. One of these things was Cosmos, which the group working on Cosmos at the time, All in Bits, had an office based out of downtown Berkeley. And so that's how I kind of got sucked into Cosmos specifically, after having worked on teaching classes on blockchain development at Cal.
Okay. So you actually you go also way back and are connected to the Cosmos group.
That's right, just tangentially at first. So I knew of them, and then some of my colleagues went on to start companies in the Cosmos space and start, found projects. So, for example, the Osmosis co-founders, Sunny and Dave, they also came out of Blockchain at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And generally, I think a lot of the foundational Cosmos projects are tied to Berkeley in one way or the other.
Right. Well, let's dive into the Evmos ecosystem. As far as I understand, so Evmos was launched almost a year ago. We were corrected. Tell us about the genesis story. Like, how did you get started? How did you onboard? How did you come up to, co-founding Evmos, and where did you recognize the need for it?
Yeah, so to introduce Evmos, I need to introduce Ethermint, and Ethermint is a project from early on in Cosmos's lifetime. And it was always kind of theorized that what Cosmos needed was something they called a peg zone at the time. I don't think we use that terminology anymore. But essentially, what they wanted to do was they wanted to take the Ethereum state as it existed at the time and move it into a new chain built within Cosmos. Now, I don't know how much context your audience has on Cosmos, but would it be worth diving into what Cosmos is for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Because obviously, in order to understand where you're coming from, absolutely. I think we have an eclectic audience, so you can totally brush up on the cores of Cosmos.
Super. So Cosmos is not a chain, not a single chain at least. It's an ecosystem of builders and chains that adhere to a certain philosophy, or several philosophies, actually, a set of philosophies, if you will. And so what this means is, specifically, is that many who build in the Cosmos ecosystem, believe in the app chain thesis. The app chain thesis is one that says, hey, it doesn't make sense for hundreds and thousands even of smart contracts to all be deployed onto the same blockchain layer, whether that's an L1 or an L2, because ultimately, the stacks that these applications are built on should be specialized for them, right? And shouldn't need to share block space with other unrelated applications. The easiest way to explain this is, back in the day, around the time I joined, actually a little bit later, you had CryptoKitties launch, which was one of the first big, famous NFT projects. And what you saw happen at the time was users who wanted to interact with applications like Compound or Uniswap, unrelated to the CryptoKitties launch, just couldn't. The network was congested because everybody was busy, minting and transferring over their CryptoKitties. And so this is an instance where the popularity of one app hurt the user experience of the other apps. And this is like an unusual experience if you're used to Web 2, for example. If you think about it, if a site like Instagram is looking at a lot of traffic, you don't get a slowdown on Amazon.com or Google.com or anything like that. It's a very strange kind of thing to accept. And the reason for this is because basically the supply of block space, of Ethereum mainnet block space, is finite. And so that creates this competitive dynamic between users competing for the same block space, right? And so it would just so happen that CryptoKitties users were willing to pay more to get their transactions included in the block than other applications users. They were just stuck kind of waiting for their transaction to get processed. And so Cosmos says, hey, actually, there's a scaling solution here that makes a lot of sense, and that's the app chain thesis, circling back to what we were talking about originally. And that means giving each application its own chain, which implicitly also means giving each application its own block space. So it doesn't need to be competitive. Now, the one downside to doing this is that you lose one of the properties that makes building on Ethereum mainnet so great, which is every application can talk to other applications out of the box. They have like the shared API you can write in the same language, and once you deploy on Ethereum mainnet, you can assume that every application utilizes the same address space. Not so with Cosmos, where every application is deployed on its own chain, but the folks who were early to Cosmos thought about this and designed a protocol called IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, as I think you mentioned earlier, in order to facilitate cross-chain interactions. Broadly, the Cosmos interchain, the collection of every chain that is IBC enabled, is branded as the Internet of Blockchains. At least this was a motto used early on, which aspires to basically offer an experience that parallels what the internet does in Web 2, but built on top of decentralized technology. So I think we're going back up the stack now, and I can finally talk about Ethermint. But one last thing before we get there is that to make all of this possible, the Cosmos SDK was designed. So the software development kit, that's what the SDK there stands for. And what this does is it allows builders to build their applications with an out-of-the-box customizable blockchain stack. So, right, for example, most blockchain networks run on the Tendermint consensus engine. And so,
I was just going to...
Sorry, go on.
Sorry for interjecting. In terms of the Tendermint, as far as I understand, so it's the base consensus algorithm, right? Some argue it's sort of the most trusted proof of stake algorithm. Am I on the right track?
Well, most trusted is a subjective term here, but if I had to,
yeah, it's a bit.
If I had to count the number of chains that use Tendermint, I think most, at least blockchains we know today, likely use the Tendermint consensus engine just because of how prolific Cosmos chains have become. I think there's over 200 of them at this point, and a lot of early consensus attempts have kind of fallen to the wayside. And there are newer consensus algorithms than Tendermint, and Tendermint itself has been rebranded into Comet BFT. So there is quite a lot to say about this. I wouldn't want to get bogged down. I'm not going to say one way or the other.
No. No. It was just to explain what Tendermint was, just really quickly. But yeah, I mean, most of our audience is probably familiar.
Certainly.
But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And, for developers building applications, they don't want to have to mess with the P2P peering layer or the consensus layer or, anything of that, the RPCs for block level information. This is all kind of not within the typical skill set of an application developer, someone who would be writing smart contracts and deploying them to Ethereum mainnet. And so the Cosmos folks thought about, okay, how do we emulate that experience as easily as possible? Well, okay, why don't we build an SDK that gives developers all of this lower level stuff out of the box and allows them to focus on building their application level logic with customizable modules. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see this in some of the standard modules, like the governance module, brings voting and proposing capabilities to the application layer of the chain. The staking module brings staking functionality. The bank module brings the typical ledger balance tracking functionality as well. And so these modules can be replaced as well. So if you don't like the way the bank module currently works, you can replace it with your own bank module, but leaving in the staking and the governance modules. And this is the beauty of the Cosmos SDK. It's that they give you a ton of the, I guess, you call them the standard modules out of the box, and you can customize them, to your tailor-made to your application's needs. Mm-hmm. So that's the Cosmos SDK. And what Ethermint is that we were talking about earlier, it was proposed to be an EVM Cosmos SDK chain that would, using a mechanism called a soft spoon, unlike a hard fork, it would not necessarily be a fork of Ethereum. It would just it would be kicked off at Genesis, starting at a certain block on Ethereum mainnet. And so the state itself would be reflected on the Ethermint chain. So that history, that's all to say, we haven't even talked about the history of Evmos, but I introduced all that because it would be impossible to explain what Evmos is without that context.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah. So Ethermint chain never really launched. So we're talking back in 2017, 2018. I always talk about this, but I know that there is a video on YouTube dated to about 2018 that features Chris Goes talking about Ethermint 2.0. So we know that at least by 2018, Ethermint was on its second iteration. There may have been more attempts to launch Ethermint after that, but ultimately nobody ended up doing it. And my co-founder Federico, had been working on Ethermint at that time, mm-hmm. and was frustrated that it hadn't launched yet. And so he branched out and made a proposal to the Cosmos Hub for some grant funding in order to bring a team together to launch Ethermint, which later got renamed to Evmos as the chain, and the rest is history.
Okay. And I take it then Federico brought you on to continue the Evmos story?
That's right. So Fede and I actually met in our time at blockchain at Berkeley, and that's how he got kind of wrapped up in Cosmos as well. And he's one of the core contributors to the Cosmos SDK and the IBC protocol too.
Okay. So yeah, with what you just explained, I mean, you basically alluded to where Evmos lies between EVM and Cosmos, Right. So as far as just my understanding is that, so Evmos uses the Cosmos SDK, the Tendermint core, and the IBC protocol. And if you can maybe take us from here, or if I'm overgeneralizing this, please interject. Because it also for me, I mean, I'm familiar with Cosmos, and I've been researching with how Evmos is set up and trying to understand the ins and outs. But it would be very useful, if you can maybe talk about this a little bit more. So in terms of Evmos being, where does Evmos lie between the EVM and Cosmos? I take it it's like right smack in the middle.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question. So all Cosmos chains live independently of one another. And that's important to emphasize because sovereignty is an important concept in the Cosmos ecosystem. But they can obviously all talk to each other over IBC, which is a protocol that's built into the stack. Ethereum doesn't support IBC, obviously. And so Ethereum has trouble communicating with most Cosmos chains that exist today. This is the gap that Evmos could fill by launching a chain with the Cosmos SDK, as you mentioned, that supports IBC and Tendermint core, and now Comet BFT. Evmos could help out here because Evmos, even though it supports the EVM, it also supports IBC. And there are plenty of EVM to EVM bridges out there already. And so the proposal here was to build an EVM to EVM bridge between Ethereum mainnet and Evmos, or not to build, to just deploy an EVM to EVM bridge between Ethereum mainnet and Evmos, and then have users, developers, and assets come over that bridge into Evmos and then spill over into the greater Cosmos ecosystem via IBC. Now, IBC is a little different than traditional bridge mechanisms in that it's understood to be trust minimized by the majority of people in the space. I think there's some contention around what trust minimized is versus trustless. But the thing to understand is that IBC leverages light client proofs to guarantee a higher level of security than what typical bridges that rely on multi-sigs might do, if that's clear.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's why it's assumed that once you bring assets into Cosmos world, that it's mainly safer to bridge those assets over to a different IBC chain. The experience is a little better because the chain itself understands bridging semantics, or can be made to understand bridging semantics. And there are a few other mechanisms that can be built on top of that. But once you enter Cosmos world, you're in IBC world, and that's where the improved bridging experience comes into play. And Evmos acted as this port city, as this port of entry into Cosmos for Ethereum, if that makes sense.
I want to take a little turn. I saw actually on Twitter today that there's a scheduled debate on, it's supposed to be, or I think it was quoted as a spicy topic, which is the cross-chain, not multi-chain topic, or actually it's more of a thesis. Can you dive more into that and the problem that addresses?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think of Evmos as just this transport layer between Ethereum and Cosmos, with Evmos itself being a Cosmos chain, I think we might not be 100% prepared to take on this debate. But once you start to realize that, hey, actually IBC as an arbitrary message passing mechanism between chains can support not just liquidity transfers, but any arbitrary message. So that includes smart contract function calls, right? So a smart contract on Evmos can call a smart contract on a different Cosmos chain like Juno. It can call into the native chain functionality on chains like Osmosis, etc. And what that means is actually, hey, you can build these cross-chain experiences. You can build applications that support these cross-chain experiences. And that's what we mean by cross-chain. It's that, you can deploy an application on Evmos, let's say, and it can interact with applications on Juno, right? Which is very atypical, really, for a blockchain. Typically, when we think of blockchains, you need to deploy a decentralized application to the same chain in order to interact with other decentralized applications on that chain. But IBC allows decentralized applications to go cross-chain in a trust-minimized fashion, reducing the friction there, right? And so kind of the thesis here is that, hey, actually, there's a famous Vitalik post about how he believes the future will be multi-chain, meaning that, applications will deploy the same set of contracts to multiple chains, and they'll have to maintain those instances independently. Whereas the cross-chain folks believe, hey, this is a terrible developer experience, let alone a terrible user experience, right? Because you're basically fragmenting things like the same tokens across multiple chains. They might not be fungible when you bring them together, when you can try and consolidate, since these are, different deployments. The bridging experience is bespoke from that, and it varies from chain to chain. So the chains between Ethereum and Avalanche may be different than Solana and Phantom, and that also affects the user experience. And so, the question here is, hey, actually, why don't we move towards a world where you deploy once and can run everywhere? Like, as a developer, why can't you, build anywhere and reach any user, any asset out there that exists on any other chain? Why does it matter? Why should it matter where you choose to end up deploying? Why do you have to worry about that sort of lock-in at that point, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
Why do you have to think about scaling in such an inefficient way, in terms of like having to deploy and manage several instances of the same code every time? So if there's a security vulnerability, the patch involves changing the code on multiple different blockchains, not just one, and having to understand the quirks and nuances of each of that blockchain's execution stack, right? So in most cases, that's the EVM, but that can also be like the SVM, like the Solana VM, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what Cosmos is building towards is this cross-chain future where developers can build on the stack that best suits their applications and their users' needs. And then they'll be able to, as we call it, go anywhere. They'll be able to go everywhere, regardless of what users are using their own native chain or a different chain. So they'll still be able, like, for example, for someone who deploys on Evmos, they'll still be able to reach users on Injective, let's say. Those users on Injective don't need to be Evmos users. However, they still will have access to Evmos applications. And that's the guarantee we want to make developers. Like, for example, in Web 2, developers who deploy on AWS aren't siloed to AWS. They can still reach users who may be, using applications on, I don't know if this is like a great analogy, I don't know if it translates very well, but they can still reach users who are using applications built on top of like Google Cloud or something, right? And so like having to have the user actually think about and can have to consider both the blockchain they're using as well as the bridge layer that they may be using is a little counterintuitive. It's a little bit of an anti-pattern. And as much as possible, Cosmos is, again, like I said earlier, they're trying to build towards this future where you have the internet of blockchains, an experience that mirrors what we're used to on the native internet. And an experience like that is only really possible in a cross-chain world where developers can reach anyone, anywhere with their applications, and users don't have to worry about bridge risk.
You actually just, you alluded to, I was going to ask about the siloed blockchains. It's also in Evmos's Twitter description, which says home for native cross-chain applications, build dApps free from the confines of siloed blockchains. So this goes sort of hand in hand with what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all goes back to this central idea for Evmos, at least. You can think of Evmos as this programmable interoperability layer or middleware for decentralized applications that does like this cross-chain coordination between multiple Cosmos IBC chains and also between Ethereum and the rest of Cosmos. So essentially, if you have workflows that span a ton of other chains or even just one other chain, you can build those workflows into Evmos, and Evmos will execute them, for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And so, concretely, what this might look like is if you were to want, what does a leveled up Aave look like? Right now, Aave is deployed on several chains, but these instances, rarely talk to each other. So how do we improve on that? Well, what we can do is we can say, take a cross-chain Aave, for example, that's deployed on Evmos and a bunch of other chains. Now you, as a borrower, looking to take out a loan, you actually have access to lenders, liquidity from lenders from several different chains as opposed to just your own chain where liquidity might be limited. And so you can actually lend on chain A and borrow against that on chain B and have the application just do all of the verification level logic to make that happen, right? And you can have, many-to-many relationships between a single application and other applications built on other chains here. And of course, their users and all of the assets that underlie each of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, this also kind of addresses one of the key constraints within the Cosmos ecosystem, which is that chains that just do one thing, chains that just, run a single application or a few applications, are typically smaller than, monolithic, bigger chains like Ethereum mainnet that, may support hundreds or even thousands of applications, right? But this ultimately doesn't matter as much, so, things like TVL and volume aren't really the correct metrics to look at when looking at Cosmos chains because they do support smaller use cases, right? And it's understandable that smaller use cases may have less usage, right? But keep in mind that the TVL that a Cosmos chain has access to, for, let's say, swaps, for cross-chain asset swaps, the liquidity that a Cosmos chain has access to isn't just limited to the liquidity that lives on that chain, but the liquidity that can be found across any Cosmos chain out there, of which there are about, I think, over 200 at this point.
Yeah, it would be actually really good to...
Let me know if any of that didn't make sense and I can go deeper.
No, it totally does. No, it's just piecing it together. I'm just, no, it absolutely does. And I'm glad to dive into more of the technical framework. So, okay, just backtracking. Okay, we know Evmos is based on the Cosmos SDK stack. It's EVM fully interoperable chain. Just trying to maybe for the audience, if you could explain the differences between fully interoperable EVM chains and other EVM chains.
Yeah, totally. So interoperability isn't like a formal property or anything like that, but broadly, the way we use it in the Cosmos ecosystem is that essentially the Evmos chain can interact with other chains, and sort of the design space that opens up lends itself well to a broader set of tooling and applications that can be built on top of those kinds of stacks. So if you take, for example, a chain like Ethereum mainnet or Polygon or Avalanche, so all of the, as I mentioned earlier, a few years ago, I would have said with confidence that, a lot of the applications there are restricted to their own mainnet, right? Their own chain. Nowadays, I think all of those ecosystems are seeing kind of this flourishing of a new paradigm, which is, for example, Avalanche is launching its subnets. And that kind of mirrors kind of what the Cosmos ecosystem is doing with its app chain thesis. And so applications, I assume, on Avalanche will be interoperable with those subnets that are applications built on top of these new subnets that are launching. What I mean by interoperable is just that, it's short for interoperate, right? So, or it's the adjective for interoperate. And so it means exactly what it sounds, which is like, they can just, two chains can interact with one another. And the way we mean it is that experience is seamless, trust minimized, and actually built into the protocol as opposed to relying on a third-party bridge. So nowadays there are plenty of general message passing bridges. I know Axelar, Celer, Layer 0, Hyperlane, all these are protocols that are built on top of the execution layer, the EVM layer, for a lot of blockchains. But this means that the protocol itself doesn't understand what they are. It just sees them as another smart contract. And these bridges typically introduce like a different attack surface to the equation, right? So, when you're operating between two different chains, you're basically trusting chains A and B simultaneously, and then introducing a third-party bridge means you have to trust that bridge as well, right? Even if you trust chain A and if you trust chain B, you also have to trust the bridge that you're using. And ideally, we don't have to do that. In a perfect world, we would be able to interoperate seamlessly between chains A and B in a trust minimized fashion. And that's where IBC comes in here. And so that's what we mean when we talk about Evmos being an interoperable EVM. Yeah. It's that you can build for the cross-chain by default with an API that the protocol itself provides as opposed to, a third-party bridge, which has the additional benefit of being ergonomic and much better for the developer experience.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thanks for that. My team and I, we talk, obviously there's so much talk about security and scalability and decentralization. I mean, this is what everyone's sort of obsessed with. Where would you place Evmos on the blockchain trilemma diagram? I hope I'm not putting you on the spot with this question.
No, yeah, not at all. It's a good question because I think when people talk about this diagram, I remember kind of hearing about the blockchain trilemma for the first time, like early on in like 2016, 2017. And I think we've come a long way since then. We've, kind of come up with orthogonal methods of addressing like the scalability issue, for example. L2s didn't exist when this trilemma came about, and like the app chain theory. The app chain thesis wasn't around as a mechanism for scaling Ethereum. And so I think people would look at it very differently back then. And there's also like proof of work versus proof of stake, and these properties apply differently to proof of work chains versus proof of stake chains. So for example, when it comes to decentralization, you look at proof of work and you say, well, okay, you might want to take into account like the geographic distribution of the nodes, right? The nodes themselves. Whereas in proof of stake, it matters a little bit less, especially for the way Tendermint consensus runs. The geographic distribution is a little separate from the economic decentralization of the chain. And so what I mean by that is that actually it doesn't matter if you have like 20 different node operators or 100 or 1,000. What does matter is how spread out the stake is. It doesn't matter if you have like 200 node operators, but one of them has 2/3 of the stake, versus if you have 20 node operators and the stake is evenly distributed across them, right?
Yes.
And so that matters a lot for decentralization. And broadly, you can think of decentralization as the property of like how difficult is it to attain like a supermajority in the network. How difficult is it to actually subvert the node operators of the network? And I guess for some networks, it might not even be the node operators, right? If you're working with delegated POS, you might be delegating to like non-validating nodes or different actors. And so it gets really dicey and complicated there. The other things that you might want to consider with decentralization is how resistant is it to these like social layer attacks? Like, for example, an interesting case study is, FTX and Solana. And when the FTX incident went down, there was a mass unbonding on Solana, reducing its security, right? And we'll talk about what security means as well.
Right.
But one might argue that the reason for that is because Solana wasn't sufficiently, or its interests weren't sufficiently decentralized, right? And that's why something like that could happen. And this has nothing to do with the protocol itself. This is just like a real world incident that causes this to happen. I think the most quantitative measure of decentralization is the Nakamoto consensus, which is, I forget the formal description, but basically it's the minimum number of nodes that it would take to subvert the network, or the minimum number of actors that it would take to subvert the network. And so that's also important to take into account. But what I'm trying to paint a picture here of is that decentralization doesn't really have a formal definition, right? I think the definition is much clearer in proof of work world versus proof of stake world. Now, how this applies to Evmos is Evmos has 150 permissionless validators running proof of stake. That number can change in the future. That is all governance controlled, and so governance can decide to up the number of validators that are running on the network. Right now, it's like there are finite validator slots that can actively produce blocks. And some might look at that and say, well, Ethereum has like thousands of validators, whereas Cosmos chains have like typically within the range of 50 to 200 validators. Isn't that bad for decentralization? But again, going back to the point, in Cosmos's proof of stake model, you only really need to look at the way the stake is distributed over the set of block producing nodes, and that's the important thing there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was about to move on to security.
Sorry.
In case you had anything to add there.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Sorry. I think we have a lag, so it's awkward if I keep jumping in. So yeah, go for it. Security. Yeah,
no worries. So, the way I like to think about security is not in terms of, a lot of people think about security in terms of like, has the code been audited? Is there a possible exploit or a possible bug in the code that makes it insecure? But that's not typically what's meant by security. A lot of people might call this like game theoretic security. That's the security that I think people typically look at when it comes to blockchain networks. Not to understate the fact that like code security is important. Mm-hmm. Audits are important, best practices, testing, etc. These are all great things to have. But when we talk about security, we talk about like economic security or consensus level security. Like, how easy is it to execute like a long range attack or like an eclipse attack, and how economically secure is your network in the first place? So, for example, and this goes hand in hand with decentralization a little bit, but would it be easy for somebody to obtain a supermajority of your network and then kind of compromise it that way? And would it be in anyone's best interests to do so? So that leans more towards like the decentralization element. But can people censor your transactions? Can validators execute like a double spend, maybe not natively on the chain, but can they, spoof a double send to like somebody who like an off-chain light client, or to another network that is relying on consensus proofs to validate the state of your chain? These are all things that we typically think about when it comes to security. And I think if you had to summarize it, like, is there a way to steal a user's funds in a way that is like unexpected by the core protocol, right? That is kind of maybe the best way I would describe it right now on the spot. And typically, when people talk about security, also they'll refer to like the number of tokens bonded to a network. So, this is like a function of the number of tokens relative to the number of tokens unbonded, and also the price of those tokens. So, you'll hear often that, Ethereum has over $28-30 billion worth of security backing like each and every transaction, each and every application built on Ethereum. Now, that is, of course, going to be much, much lower for Cosmos chains because they are smaller chains. But the interesting thing is that actually you can do things like borrow security from, another chain. And in that way, increasing the security of your own protocol. You can also share security, bidirectionally with them in a mechanism called mesh security. And what this means is that every chain in the mesh benefits from additional security, where essentially nodes from all chains are subject to slashing, right, for misbehavior. And so, misbehavior is, I guess, another framing to think about security. And so, this is still fairly early on in the Cosmos ecosystem. I think interchain security has come to the Cosmos Hub or is in the process of coming to the Cosmos Hub. There are consumer chains. What I mean by that is chains that consume the Cosmos Hub security. And that's the chain that Atom lives on, by the way, in case any of your audience members have heard of Atom.
Yeah, right.
And it gets confusing because there's the Cosmos ecosystem and then the Cosmos Hub. The Cosmos ecosystem obviously is not a chain.
Right.
The Hub is a chain. Anyway, that's a whole kind of a story in itself. But this is all to say that there are ways that Cosmos is working on building up each chain's security in a way that could parallel Ethereum's security and the security that it offers to its L2s, right? Because L2s don't need to worry about this for the most part. Right.
Well, speaking of security, so I remember reading that there were talks regarding shared security on Cosmos. So if I'm understanding correctly, are there any signs on that front? Like, are you having shared security with Cosmos?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think right now the first chains that are launching are I think Neutron. Neutron's chain is launching that shares security with the Cosmos Hub. Eventually Stride, which is a liquid staking zone, will also move to share security with the Cosmos Hub. For Evmos, shared security isn't as big of a priority as right now because it's not a new chain. It has already managed to accrue some security to itself via the bonding mechanism and slashing.
Okay.
Evmos itself is seen as a hub for EVM applications, and so what we might get is applications that are built on Evmos today launching their own chains and sharing security with Evmos. But really what's most likely to happen is to have Evmos share security with other big chains within the Cosmos ecosystem, like Osmosis, Juno, and in that way, like I mentioned, both offering its own security to them as well as consuming their security, and to the net benefit of all three chains, right? And any other chains to which the mesh is extended to. And I hope that answers your question there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Back to decentralization. I think you painted a fair representation or like an explanation of what the decentralization term means in terms of stake distribution. Can you talk a bit more about how the validation works with Evmos? I took a look at the Block Explorer and I saw that there were roughly 150 active validators. Are you planning to extend this number?
Yeah, totally. So it's not really up to me as a contributor to the Evmos project. It's up to governance Cosmos chains are really interesting in that they're also DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, that have governance modules built into them. And what this means is that, they can vote on changing their own parameters in governance in protocols. So there's not really a need to do like the snapshot governance that Ethereum applications are used to, because Ethereum has not a very good understanding of governance, right? Like the Ethereum mainnet doesn't have governance and voting primitives built into it, in the same way that Cosmos does, at least. And so, yes, governance may decide that, we want to actually up the number of active validators running our network. So once you run a validator, taking it from the top, once you decide, I want to run a validator, all you have to do is download the Evmos client software, run a few commands. First of all, you need to ensure that you have a good list of peers to connect to, and you can hop in the Discord for that. I think there are a few repos out there that list Evmos peers. But essentially, yeah, all you need to do is download the client software, have a list of peers at the ready, configure your node properly. Once you've connected to the network, you make a transaction that establishes your public validator, or your operator address as a valid validator on the network, and you start off as inactive at that point. You're not producing blocks because you're not in the active set of 150 validators. So there are 150 active validators. There are many more entities out there that have created validators that either never entered the active set in the first place or were kicked out of it after some time because they couldn't compete with the rest of the folks in the validator set. Mm-hmm. After you've established your validator, you need to be able to convince, you need to be able to bond some amount of tokens to your validator. But then you also need to be able to convince outside users to delegate to you, right? If that makes sense.
Yes.
And basically the 150 validators active set is the set of the validators with the highest amount of tokens bonded to them, delegated to them, right? Which also confers voting rights and some amount of staking rewards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. By the way, are you directly connected to a centralized exchange?
So I know that there are a few centralized exchanges that list the Evmos token, but we ourselves don't really communicate with exchanges to do the listings or anything like that. I mean, Evmos is a permissionless protocol, and any exchange is welcome to list Evmos token.
Right. Great. Well, I think there's been a lot on the technical front. I have a couple more sort of, I would say, general questions. We talk a lot about obviously the open source. How would I say this? Yeah, in terms of the open source ethos, and wondering if I could ask this question. Might be a little bit of a tangent, but given that users of Ethermint clearly benefit from your infrastructure, how do they give back to the Evmos ecosystem and community? I feel like this is like a topic I come across more often now. I was just wondering if I could get your spin on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to clarify, I mentioned Ethermint used to be what the Evmos chain would have been called, and then that evolved into Evmos.
Right.
Ethermint, that name has been retained, but it now describes the EVM module that is built for Cosmos chains. So Evmos is one of the primary...
Yeah, right. Sorry, I should have...
Yeah, no worries.
I should have made that disclaimer.
No worries. So...
my head was all up in the manifesto.
That makes a lot of sense. No worries at all. So Ethermint is the name given to the EVM module that Evmos uses. As I mentioned earlier, the Cosmos SDK lets you build all kinds of modules. So we turned Ethereum's EVM into a Cosmos module as well, and that's called Ethermint today. Evmos, so, this was a pleasant surprise that after Evmos's launch, we discovered that, hey, this EVM on Cosmos module that we built is actually very, very popular. Like, a lot of people want to use this thing. And so what you saw was, chains like Kava that have been running for a long time, they were adopting Ethermint. Mm-hmm. You saw Crypto.com launch Kronos, and that uses Ethermint. You saw chains like Canto launch, and that also uses Ethermint too, right? And so, yeah, Ethermint is quite popular these days, and dare I say, maybe one of the most popular EVM stacks out there. Now, the question you asked is, okay, well, how do we benefit from open source? I think it's all part of, it's just the ethos of being good citizens. Like, we would not have been able to build Evmos had it not been with the Cosmos SDK, which itself is open source. Tendermint is open source. IBC is open source. But also for us, it's actually had these unexpected benefits of opening up pathways to collaboration, allowing us to learn from other folks who are using our software, being able to do shared disclosures of security patches and exploits. So there may be security issues that we might catch, that other teams might catch who use our software, and having those bi-directional relationships with those folks has been very, very useful. And generally, a lot of folks have also managed to essentially make improvements to some of our software. And, there's a lot of learnings to be had there as well.
Sort of leads me to my next question. Okay, yeah, it's open source and ethos. How do you consider, or do you consider competition in the L2 space? Or do you even think about it that way, as a competition or not? Or how do you...
Between Cosmos chains?
Yeah, just...
Between Cosmos chains and Ethereum L2s?
Yeah, for example.
Well, there are different mechanisms for scaling Ethereum and just decentralized applications in general. There may be some competitive elements, but I think on net, the Web3 space benefits hugely from having multiple approaches to solving the same issue. And so I do think that if you look, extrapolate and look, 5-10 years from now, you'll see that we'll probably be leaning on both of these solutions quite heavily as a path to move forward in scaling. And I think, I forget what conference it was, but it might have been sometime in ETH Denver, but this year. But Martin Kopelman from Gnosis and CowSwap, I think he might have put out a really good talk on why the future of scaling Ethereum relies on both L2s and Cosmos-like L1s as extensions of what Ethereum is capable of. Because the major issue here is that Ethereum itself doesn't change that much over time. Like, there's not new functionality added to it. And you can see that with recent developments in like EIP 4337, like in account abstraction, it's not implemented into the protocol directly, right? So you continue to expect it to not change and not evolve with the times and as new use cases come about. And that's actually what you want. You don't want a layer that secures billions of dollars in TVL and has like all these users and applications to actually change too much over time, right? You want it to remain kind of stable as is. And so, and you don't want to change too quickly either. And that's where like L2s come in. That's where L1s that kind of extend Ethereum come in as well. And so, yeah, I do see a future where there is some competitive element perhaps, but I think the collaborative element for me is much more compelling.
How do you see the future with EVM 10 years down the road?
Yeah, so...
And in terms of, I mean, there's got to be network effects for sure, but I mean, do you think about that? 10 years is a long ways away.
Totally. Well, we're already... quite a ways in with the EVM, and it hasn't sort of ceded any of its dominance amongst developer mindshare. I think at this point there's just so much mindshare entrenched into building with the EVM. The tooling is just already there. It's well understood. It's in many funny ways. It's very limited in what it can do, which forces people to come up with interesting ways of getting around its limitations. And I suspect that a lot of developers actually do like the simplicity of being able to build with the EVM that restricts kind of your design space a little bit. Because most use cases don't need sophisticated functionality. And for those who do, they can go beyond and use their like call data tricks to push the EVM further. Now there have been, I think many would say like, hey, actually, the Move VM is an improvement over the EVM, or CosmWasm is a much better developer experience than building with the EVM. And I've seen many languages and VMs come and go throughout the years in the space. Hopefully, I haven't been in here that long, maybe like 6 years, I would say 6 or 7. But the EVM has persisted, and Solidity as the main language for the EVM has persisted. Right. And it's only gotten more interesting and more entrenched, not less. Now, other languages are catching up, and there are a few promising ones kind of launching. I think like the SVM has like seen like really great success as well. With both in terms of developer mindshare and tooling, but there's just something about the EVM that keeps people using it, and I think it is just the amount of tutorials for new users. When people look up, how to get started building on Ethereum or how to get started building dApps, Solidity tutorials are going to be the first tutorials that come up. I think a lot of folks are like, trying to build certain domain-specific languages, and I think those, for certain types of applications, and I think those might see greater success within their own domains, like for if you want to build games or something. I do think that some of the efforts around replacing the EVM might be a little misguided. Like, hey, building like a JavaScript-like language is going to be the future because there are X number of JavaScript developers in the world. But, the core issue here is that when you try and port over JavaScript-like semantics into the blockchain world, that language ends up looking different, and the tooling around it ends up looking different than what a JavaScript developer's usual workflow would involve. And so, yeah, that in itself is an issue. I am sympathetic, though, to the fact that, I think Electric Capital puts out these reports every now and again, annually maybe, or biannually, on the number of developers building with each execution environment. I think the number of EVM developers is actually quite low. According to their studies, it's like somewhere in the 2000s or, lower thousands, if I remember correctly. Kind of just going off here.
That's not a lot.
It's not a lot at all, especially relative to the number of developers out there in the world, right? And which number in the millions, right? So one might say, hey,
no, it's like nothing.
Yeah, one might say, hey, we're still early. Like the winner hasn't been decided yet.
Right. Yeah.
But I think the fact that Ethereum will continue to use the EVM into the future. Now, the EVM might be improved and extended, and I think that's kind of the attitude that Evmos is taking. And a single chain can actually run multiple VMs, and so you might see Evmos adopt like a new VM like Cosmosm, and having us work, on Cosmosm compatibility might be in the cards in the future. But all of this is to say that, hey, I mean, the fact that Ethereum uses the EVM and will continue to use the EVM into the future, and all of its L2s also rely on the EVM, is kind of like a shelling point for developer mindshare, like accruing to the EVM. So unless that changes, I think it will be a tough sell. But yeah, those are just some disorganized thoughts on that.
No, not at all. It's fair enough. It's this has been super insightful, Nic. We definitely covered a lot of ground, which it does kind of bring me up to sort of wrap this up. You didn't mention account abstraction before. I thought I saw that in your 2023 roadmap, which does seem packed, by the way, from tackling interchain accounts and liquid staking all the way to also like I thought I saw dApp store post second quarter. What's next for the Evmos ecosystem, and can you speak to any of those milestones in your roadmap?
Yeah, I think the main one to get excited for is the EVM extensions that are coming to Evmos, essentially giving EVM smart contracts access to the underlying Cosmos functionality. So I mentioned those Cosmos modules early on. Those can be built into the chain, but the EVM smart contracts kind of just live in EVM world. They don't typically have access to any outside functionality. And this is typical for, like on Ethereum mainnet, this is how like the EVM on Ethereum mainnet works. And so what we can do is through a feature called precompiles that is built into the EVM, we can extend what's possible in the EVM and give smart contracts access to Cosmos level functionality. So we can give smart contracts access to IBC to make IBC transfers. We can give smart contracts access to staking to allow smart contracts to stake. We can give smart contracts access to voting on governance proposals, and so people can start building DAOs that can actually vote on native governance and represent the interests of the collective interests of a certain DAO. Right. And so, the limits of what's possible is very interesting. In the future, we might be able to extend this to include things like account abstraction, as you mentioned. Things like cron jobs are being considered as well. Cron jobs are scheduled tasks that you can basically say, hey, I'm going to pay for this transaction now, but please execute it like 3 days from now or something. And so, this goes back to having Evmos be that programmable middleware for the rest of the interchain. Like many other Cosmos chains don't have an EVM. They don't support like MetaMask. They don't support Foundry or Hardhat or Truffle or any of the tooling available to smart contract developers today. Right? They are truly application-specific chains. And that's where Evmos can help fill in the gaps, is say, hey, listen, okay, there's something that this application chain is focused on doing really, really well, but it can't do everything. build on Evmos to help supplement what it needs to be doing. So yeah, that's EVM extensions is the main, I think, message to take away here.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask. But also, is there anything or any other key takeaway to add that I haven't asked about or I might have missed? Because it is a complex world you have going on over there.
Oh, totally. There's
for the regular folks to understand, and even Web3 people. I mean, it's there's a lot to dissect.
Yeah, absolutely. We're juggling a lot all the time. That's not just Evmos folks. That's not just Cosmos folks. That's just everyone in crypto is always having to have like 20 tabs open just to understand what's going on. But no, yeah, I mean, Evmos is
like that.
For sure. Evmos is a fast, secure, simple hub that brings all of the battle-tested tooling EVM developers know and love to the Cosmos ecosystem and pushes them further by giving you the ability to leverage cross-chain interactions in a trust-minimized way. I think if there's one thing that people take away here is that Web3 can do more than what it's been doing so far. Like the space of possible use cases have been vastly underexplored, even within DeFi, but beyond DeFi as well. And so I think the way we get there is by enabling developers to build more easily in, more complex cross-chain environments, and also making the user experience a lot better, such that the user doesn't need to care about what blockchain they're using. They just can focus on the application itself and forget about the underlying infrastructure layer. If there's one thing that blockchains can do right, it's to remove themselves from the mental equation 10 years from now. I'd be very sad if that didn't happen, if users still had to think about the blockchain layer. Right,
yeah. And actually, to kind of be a geek and quote your manifesto, which states, one of the thoughts that I had written down was that the Evmos core development team is building for a world where the next million Web3 users are simply regular users.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that speaks a lot for what you were just for what you took us through. So thanks for that. Nic, what's the best way to follow your work and maybe, of course, our contact and, of course, participate, et cetera, in your ongoing efforts?
For all updates related to Evmos, do follow Evmos.org. That's EVMOS.org on Twitter. We have a Discord and Telegram community that you should feel free to join. For myself, I'm Nic_XYZ. That's NIC_XYZ. And I tweet out my thoughts sometimes. So yeah, happy to have folks listen in.
Yeah, awesome. I did see that you're also more of a new Twitter user, if I'm not mistaken. I did stalk your profile before.
Well, I've been lurking on... I've been lurking on Twitter for a while now, but I thought it finally was time to sort of start sharing some thoughts here. Yeah,
I have sort of a love-hate relationship with it, but it's where the action is, so... it's good to follow that. Great. Well, we'll include all of this information in our show notes. And with that thought in mind, well, thank you so much for this Evmos dive and the conversation. I mean, it certainly helps to paint the macro and the micro picture of its role in solutions, products. It obviously clarifies its connection to Cosmos and what it provides, and also by leveraging Cosmos and Ethereum's tech and ecosystems. So it all sounds very promising, and your roadmap is pretty stacked. I look forward to your milestones in 2023. So Nic, thanks for being with us, and all the best to you and your team.
Thanks, Nina. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks again to our guests, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks also to the Bariam Music team for providing their music. You can check them out on bariammusic.com. All of the supporting information is on our website, blockchainrecorded.com. You can listen to us on Google, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, as well as on YouTube, Spotify, Radio Public, and Stitcher. You can follow us on Twitter and YouTube, where we are super grateful for your support. Stay tuned for our next episode.